Hi, this is Steve Hargadon. It's the 4th of August, 2012, and I'm here with Audrey Waters. Hi, Audrey.
Hello.
This is our weekly hack education podcast based on Audrey's...
Although we've been less than weekly lately. We've been sort of intermittent.
Yes, this is our regular podcast. And part of that was travel, and part of it was that we were at the Sloan Merlot conference in Las Vegas, where we recorded a plenary session doing the same format. How do you think that went?
I really enjoyed it, and for a number of reasons. I mean, I think that it's, I always look forward to sort of sitting down and having this conversation with you, and I actually feel like when we record the podcast, that's sort of what it ends up being is sort of a conversation about what the news and analysis of the week. So it's great to have the conversation. It's great to get to do that face to face, and it was really interesting to do it in front of an audience in terms of actually having sort of immediate feedback from people who are listening, and then also to have an opportunity to get questions right there on the spot. It's questions and comments, I should say, right there on the spot.
I really had mixed emotions. I couldn't tell how the audience responded, in part because Twitter was down that morning.
Yeah.
And that's become kind of a normal part of my feedback loop.
Right. Yeah, that was interesting because I'm not sure that I could have, even if Twitter had been up, I'm not sure I could have, as we were talking, paid full attention to Twitter. But it was interesting afterwards. That was the first thing. I had no idea when we were talking that Twitter was down. And that was the first thing I checked afterwards. And I thought, wow, it must have been awful. Nobody tweeted the whole time.
Well, I watch different faces in the audience, and this is a pretty traditional crowd, right?
Yes.
Higher ed, online learning. And I saw some people clapping really, really hard, which said to me they were maybe fans of yours, and they were glad that we were there. I saw some other people, and I thought, I'm not sure that they liked what we did. But consistently, I did hear feedback that people felt that they liked the format.
Well, I think that there's a lot to be said for the format. I mean, I think that people, particularly people who attend conferences frequently, it's always interesting that we spend a lot of time as educators talking about how we can get away in the classroom from just talking at students, just lecturing to students. And yet we seem to replicate these practices in keynotes, and most of the time in keynotes are really just sort of lengthy one-way speeches. And so I think it is different to have a conversation even though it wasn't sort of completely inclusive of the audience, to have a conversation instead of just deliver a speech.
So you and I have talked about this idea. We're interested if anybody listening has any feedback, we'd love to hear it. But the idea has been to actually kind of go on tour with this as a kind of an offering, right? Holding this kind of a session in local communities that leads to a larger discussion about education. Are you still feeling good about that?
I think it's a really great idea. Partially, I think that's one of the challenges of the way that we sort of do our podcast is that typically we record it on a Friday or Saturday, and then it's a few days before we sort of get it posted online, and maybe even a couple days until I then post it and turn onto my blog. And I really do love the immediacy of having a live audience respond, and then opening it up to conversations around these topics. I think that even though with all of the social tools that we have at our disposal, whether it's blogging and comments and social networks and Twitter, it still is quite difficult to have conversations and have discussions with our colleagues and peers about some of these topics. So I would love to be able to have more of an opportunity to open these conversations up in a face-to-face setting and not just online.
I'm wondering if we could actually even break out of the kind of choir bubble that we're in, and if there would be a way for this to actually be visible or attractive to those in those communities who aren't kind of aware of the sort of more thoughtful dialogue around education?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it would be an interesting opportunity I think that's precisely right, to talk to groups that are, for a number of reasons, don't participate in these online discussions. I mean, for example, I love Twitter, but I do think that it's very easy to look at some of the conversations about education technology on Twitter, and you have to remind yourself that you really are talking to a very small fraction of the education community. And so to be able to have these conversations offline with parents, for example, with parents who aren't on Twitter or who aren't blog readers, I think would be really useful. And parents and principals and teachers and librarians, community members in general.
Yeah, I wonder if we couldn't tap into the library audience as an organizing tool. I love your post this week on education theory, and it also occurred to me that might be a really fun thing to incorporate into this, whatever it becomes.
Interesting. I mean, I think I was really pleased with the feedback to this. So this was a project that's sort of grown out of Greg Wilson initially challenging me to come up with an Audrey test and to come up with a list of things that I sort of look for when I'm talking to, in particular when I'm talking to education technology entrepreneurs, to sort of see what they know about, not just what they know about building their own product, what they know about the business of education technology, but what do they know about policy, what do they know about pedagogy, what do they know about history. And so I created the Audrey test a couple of months ago, and Greg and I have decided that we want to actually sort of take it one step further and build sort of write a guide, answer. Well, I don't know if answering the questions is quite the right way to frame it, but with short essays sort of helping explain some of the history of education, helping explain some of the folks who have been important theorists, important concepts, so that folks that are both in education and education technology and entrepreneurs and politicians can just have sort of a quick and dirty guide of where a place to look for some sort of groundwork for thinking intelligently, thinking critically about education technology. So I was pleased to see the response to my initial blog post about this.
You say quick and dirty, but ultimately the goal has to be to move it to a little bit of more of a slow and thoughtful conversation, right?
True. I mean, I think that, John Dewey is a great example. John Dewey was a philosopher, an education philosopher, but for folks who aren't familiar, folks who aren't accustomed to reading early 20th century philosophy, it would be a bit of an uphill battle for a lot of reasons to sort of assign someone readings by Dewey. And so when I say quick and dirty, I mean that really is sort of like what do you need to know about John Dewey? How influential has he been? Or I loved actually Justin Reich's comment that Dewey lost, and that Dewey hasn't been that influential. So I think a way so that people can at least have a little bit of grounding in theory, a little bit of grounding in history, so that hopefully we can. I think you're right. So we can have more thoughtful conversations. But I don't think we're planning on writing sort of an extensive, in-depth, sort of fully fleshed out sort of curriculum around education theory.
To me, the most valuable aspect of that post in the project isn't even the specific theories of the different theorists or educators. Mm-hmm. It's the fact that there are different theories. Yes,
I think that is so important, and I think that one of the things that I find very interesting is, thinking about how different ways of thinking, how different ways of theorizing the world and theorizing education as a system, learning as a process, how we aren't always conscious of the ways in which we have our own theories or the way in which our theories are aligned with certain other scholars or researchers' theories. And I think it is, to be able to explain to people the difference between sort of an instructivist approach versus a constructivist approach, to be able to talk about what it means, how does something like behaviorism and B.F. Skinner, where do we see that today in education technology products and in policies, and how are there now, and how have there been people who approached it in different ways and offered their own takes on what works and what doesn't work and why. So you're right, so that there isn't just this sort of one monolithic thing called education that has always happened, has always occurred in certain ways with certain practices and certain policies. But it's certainly always been complicated and contentious.
Well, I think part of what precipitated the Audrey test was a concern that people were jumping into educational technology projects or ventures, just assuming that doing what we're currently doing more efficiently was actually going to make things better, without understanding that they were buying into what's obviously a very Skinnerian kind of mentality about education.
Right. I think that's precisely right. And I think that, even thinking about some of the differences that we've talked about before between something like the maker movement, so the differences between the maker movement and I guess what we could call sort of curriculum around the maker movement with high-stakes standardized testing. Sort of where do those come from, not just in terms of something that's happened within the last couple of years or since No Child Left Behind, but what are the historical influences that have led us to make certain decisions, to have certain policy things in place, and I think in general sort of are also contributing to this narrative that we live under right now that education is failing, and I think that to be able to talk about our education system as a failure or it does require us think about history, think about theory before we can sort of even pretend to have some sort of idea of what possible solutions or hacks, if you will, could be.
So I'm interested in how this evolves out of the discussions of educational technology. And I participated yesterday in a session with David Thornburg and Alan November that I had known nothing about, but they're sort of our precursors. They did a back and forth podcast called Point Counterpoint, and they reprised that for Connected Educator Month. And what was really interesting was, so here are two gentlemen sort of heavily involved in the, especially David Thornburg, in the educational technology arena. But their hour-long conversation had almost nothing to do with technology. So it is interesting to me that we consider ourselves being in ed tech, but a lot of these conversations don't really have anything to do with the technology, do they?
I think that's something real that's very important to remember, and I think that it's one of the things, one of the reasons why it is so important that we recognize history and recognize theory and think about pedagogy, because if we focus too much on the technology piece of ed tech, then I fear that we're focusing on questions of hardware or software or products, and we aren't actually. It certainly makes it easier to forget about this question of teaching and learning. We get really caught up in systems and processes, and I would dare say efficiencies, and forget to talk about humans and relationships, let alone sort of knowledge.
So reading the Skinner quotes from you was kind of like reading Orwell's 1984. Right? I mean, a
and
teaching machine.
Wouldn't you say that of the 5 that I selected here, and I should note that people, there were lots of comments that, oh, you've forgotten X, Y, or Z person, and certainly we are looking more closely at someone like Seymour Papert, who I think will have his own section, particularly because of his work in technology. But I would say of the 5 I chose, Skinner is the one whose vision is closest to what we have currently in terms of ed tech.
Right, which is a behaviorist model.
Yep.
And actually the paragraph that you placed in the blog post almost felt like it could have been copied for some of the current products.
Yes, that's exactly why I chose it. And noting that it came from 1954. And so a lot of this push right now that we're, and I noticed, who in technology right now has Skinner influenced, I would say Zynga, not an education company, but certainly a gaming company that has really thinks that they've mastered behaviorism and getting people to click on things for these virtual rewards. But also this notion of adaptive learning software. I mean, that is what Skinner wanted with his teaching machine, was a programmatic way to be able to deliver lessons and have students respond to them and get positive feedback and move on to the next lesson. I mean, this is absolutely adaptive learning, although it's touted as the hot new thing, is an old thing.
Okay, so sort of opposing Skinner is Paulo Freire, the Brazilian educator, and at the bottom of each of these sections, you indicate who in educational technology has been influenced by this thinker. And so for Freire, it's you. Go ahead.
I should note here that this ties into another story, that I was at the Learning Design and Technology Expo yesterday at Stanford. I was one of the reviewers. And one of the projects, the students, these are the graduate students who just got their master's degree in ed tech at Stanford. And one of the projects mentioned Freire as their influencer. And I was thrilled because it is actually the first time in ed tech circles that I've heard Paulo Freire be listed as an influencer. And I think, to me, that's very interesting that he's sort of not necessarily part of the conversation.
Right. Well, and he obviously represents the other position, right? That Skinner's teaching machine falls right into Freire's definition of a banking model of education. And
absolutely.
And again, that very image from Waiting for Superman of the sort of the children moving along an assembly line and the head getting cracked open and knowledge being poured in. So you don't use the language that I need to read Paulo Freire, but I immediately again thought of our conversations about learning agency, because that clearly
right.
seems to be at the heart of what he's describing. Is it?
Yes, and I think, it very much is, and I think that one of the things that I find that, that he thinks of education as a practice of, the education should be a practice of liberation, and that too often these systems that we have in place in education are ways in which we systematize oppression. And he's speaking about this in terms of anti-colonialism. So he's thinking about the ways in which colonizing countries instill their education systems upon their colonies. But I think that there are lots of ways in which we can think of that, even in the United States, for example, in which the values of that education, that the values that are being and the lessons that are being taught in schools aren't really the ones that are giving students their own agency, that aren't relevant to students' own lives. They certainly aren't going to help students develop their own capacities to be free people, to be free, rational, literate powerful members, agents of their own lives.
So it feels like there are two ways to think of that. One would be sort of in a colonizing situation. You could actually ascribe some malevolence to the colonizing force, right? But in our circumstance, it feels as though we would need to look for a non-malevolent answer, right? So, why would this? How does this sort of work? What drives it? And my way of thinking about that would be that those organizations, institutions, those with finances to have an influence are going to support the things that support their existing lens or model of the world, right? So it's not as though, while there may be some back behind closed doors, cigar smoking, planning, it feels more like what's going in a society in which money and lobbying and politics drive a lot of decision making. What's going to get supported? Well, the things that will get supported are those that confirm or buttress an existing structure.
Right. I mean, and I think that it's easy to look at some of the battles that we've had around curriculum, in particular. I think around history curriculum, or even sort of what literature we should teach, for example, that you can sort of see some of the politics of this play out. But back to the project that I saw yesterday at Stanford, which I thought was a really great way of thinking about what Frere means, was that the student team had identified something in hip hop culture. They identified a pre-existing practice in hip hop culture, and rather than trying to encourage young minority males to become computer programmers by imposing the dominant culture's interest in why you should be a computer programmer, right? So that you could sort of end up doing things like Mark Zuckerberg, so you could end up being a Bill Gates. They came up with a way to help meet the needs of this particular subculture through technology. And so there's this group called sneakerheads, kids who like to adorn and modify and trick out their tennis shoes. And so they devised a system that uses Scratch and a little Android, a little piece of Android and LED lights, so that kids can learn to program flashing lights on their shoes. And I thought that was a really great example of doing just that, of finding what the community wants and helping them meet their own community needs, rather than imposing another culture's needs or the expectations of what computer science should look like. What you should build with computer science is robots. What you should build with computer science is websites. And in this case, it was, no, we'll show you that when you have these skills, you can build the things you're already building, the things that already matter to you.
Okay, that's a great blog post. We could probably spend much more time on it, and I actually hope that we do. I hope that it becomes sort of a part of this idea of going around and holding some kind of events. Of the comments where people said you didn't mention so and so, can you give us a clue as to, besides paper, who else you're going to kind of look at? Ilyich, I think for sure, and this notion of deschooling or unschooling, I think is very important. As for the rest, I'm not sure. I mean, in some ways, the idea is less to have a catalog of all of the, we aren't creating a guide that's sort of education theory 101. We want to really tackle some other more concrete issues as well. Some of the misconceptions, particularly that engineers, not to stereotype engineers, but the engineers might have about learning based on their own experiences. So we want to talk about things like learning styles. I guess engineers aren't the only folks that sort of have mistaken ideas about that. But
we want to tackle some of the misconceptions or preconceived notions that people have about learning. Or stereotypes, things like that.
I was particularly interested in thinking about people like John Holt, who or who's the Summerhill guy? Can't remember. But sort of thinking Democrat of Schooling or Jerry Mintz, because I think that often those get left out of even the broader discussions,
right?
Just because of sort of perceptions of homeschooling or unschooling. Interesting.
Yeah.
Okay, well, love that. Very fun. And so let's shift gears. I went back because we were a couple of weeks off, and also because we didn't cover a lot of the stories in the plenary session that we did. I did want to kind of bring up MOOCs one more time, although you don't have a story this week. But
there's no getting away from them.
I'm very interested in a continued impression I have that what you're calling the Stanford MOOC, and then I know that's a gloss, but it's intended to at least provide some broad categorization. I'm interested in what differentiates that from the kind of the advertisement you would see in the back of a scientific magazine to order this 12-week course from a famous Harvard professor that was recorded and videotaped. Is there a substantive difference between that Stanford model and that sort of old recorded version?
I mean, I'm not sure necessarily that there is, and I think that that's one of the the Stanford model is certainly in many ways replicating some of these things that we have done for a while now in terms of correspondence, sort of what I would call sort of a correspondence course, or best lecture in the world video series. I think that the opportunity to do things differently is that you are in a learning group with thousands of other students, and I think that this is part of the connectivist piece that on one hand these classes do provide. They do tell you that you do have thousands of peers who are taking this class with you, and from a variety of backgrounds, from a variety of academic backgrounds, and skill levels. But I think that the classes really haven't yet been able to truly, in my experience at least, tap into that social element. Of course, I think a week ago or a week and a half ago, Coursera had an offline meetup where they had a barbecue and invited a bunch of people to come offline and to sort of meet face to face and talk face to face with their fellow learners. But of course, that only works if you're in the Bay Area, and so I think that we still haven't sort of cracked the nut to take the best possible advantage of the social network piece, the community piece, what we know about sort of the way in which learning happens socially. Very much, these classes do still feel like they're a very isolating experience as a learner.
I have this sort of unsettling feeling that we're feeling the ground rumble, and that all of a sudden we're going to see hundreds, thousands of MOOCs get announced over the course of the next few months. But it doesn't feel like there are a tremendous number right now for the volume of publicity they're getting.
And I think that is an interesting piece. And on Monday of last week, the sort of second to last day in Eugene, Oregon, was ironically I was invited by the University of Oregon to come and facilitate a discussion on campus with some of the administrators and faculty member, librarian, IT staff about what the university's plans are for MOOCs, for online learning. And it was a very strange experience to think of a school like the University of Oregon that's actually offered distance education for quite some time now, to feel as though it's somehow behind, and that it isn't doing enough to offer its students this MOOC experience, and I'm not quite sure that I'm not quite sure that we're actually seeing university students demand these. I haven't really heard any university students demanding MOOCs, which isn't to say that they aren't serving a purpose. I mean, clearly there's demand. There's plenty of students who are interested in taking these classes globally. But what does it mean that students enrolled in a residential campus aren't particularly interested in MOOCs? So, again, whose needs are we serving? Again, it's not to say that these needs aren't important, but before universities sort of rush down this particular Stanford model of MOOC, I think it is worth them thinking, is this something that's meeting the needs of a non-traditional student? Is this something meeting the needs of a student who can't make it to campus, for intro to psychology because their job, they have a job at the same time that class is held. And I think that we are incredibly excited about the buzz, without necessarily thinking through the substance of why these are popular and for whom they're popular.
I'm going to get in trouble for this, but I feel like this is kind of a danger Will Robinson moment, right? In the same way that all of the financial institutions jumped on board kind of derivative investment opportunities. I can see the MOOC thing just becoming a huge wave that ultimately doesn't take us somewhere we really want to go. I hate to say that, but...
Well, it's interesting because I've been thinking a lot lately about, there are a lot of things right now in Silicon Valley that are starting to feel awfully reminiscent of previous .com bubbles, and I was thinking the other day about some of these experiments that we've seen in the past that failed miserably, including Fathom, which Columbia University is Fathom is the word that Columbia University would prefer us not to utter. It was, again, free online education that the university spent $30 million on a program that in the .com era that sort of went nowhere. And, what's hype and what's reality? And are we sort of overly exuberant about things that actually really perhaps aren't that exciting?
Okay, so speaking of hype and reality, you and I were both invited to join the organizing committees of South by Southwest EDU. And we've made different decisions, right? Sorry. Another thing Steve might get in trouble about. Okay, so I've chosen not to join the organizing group, and you've chosen to join.
Yes.
We both had a less than satisfactory experience at the conference, feeling that the corporate influence was huge, and it didn't feel like the kind of fringe, grassroots feeling that we expected for South by Southwest.
Right.
And you're interested in working from the inside to make it better. I'm kind of just not interested.
Fair enough. No, I think that South by Southwest in general has become something other than its original sort of community-based, grassroots-based fringe gathering. And so I think that as a whole, not just the education section, but the interactive, the music, and the film have certainly moved far more into, I don't even know if mainstream is the right word, but certainly all of those events have become far more corporate. And so I think that in some ways, the South by Southwest EDU sort of came too late to have any sort of grassroots potential to it. It was created sort of after South by Southwest has sort of taken this turn to the dark side. And so I'm not sure how much how much the reins can be put on that. But since this will only be its third year, I thought, well, this will be, third time's the charm. We'll see what happens if more people, if more educators and people who aren't sort of beholden to corporate interests or certain, philanthropic interests are there. Perhaps there's a chance that that things will be different. I'm not particularly hopeful, but I felt I had to give it a fair shot before writing it off.
So I'm in a dilemma now because I had hoped that we would run this sort of alternate conference at the same time, reflecting a little bit sort of those of you who stood outside, you and David Wiley and others, during the Pearson keynote. Do I go ahead with the alternate conference or do I just skip the event?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I have concerns for a number of reasons, partially because I think that, as I said, even South by Southwest Interactive has become this other beast. And thinking about people who, I think, 5 years ago would have gone to South by Southwest just don't go to the event anymore in general. So I'm not even sure that time and place is worth having a fringe festival. I mean, not to write off Austin. I mean, Austin, Texas is still a fun place to visit. It's a great place to visit, but I'm not even sure if that's the right place for a fringe festival, or if we want to have a fringe festival elsewhere.
We kind of do it at ISTE.
Yeah.
I mean, ISTE is kind of the place. The question is, does South by Southwest provide, a larger magnet draw of people who aren't in the tech world, for whom really good exploratory discussions about education would be attractive?
And I think that one of the concerns I have about, in general too, is that I attended South by Southwest EDU and then Interactive. And although there were education sessions at Interactive, they were off sort of in a different part of the city. And I'm not sure how much South by Southwest Interactive wants to make a place for education, or if they're hoping to sort of shove most of those events under the EDU umbrella, which again makes education not be part of it's this idea that education isn't everybody's issue, that there's just a special group of people and they care about education and they'll come for the first 3 days and then the real South by Southwest starts. So I'm really interested to sort of have a glimpse at the planning of this event for these and other reasons. I do think that we might have seen the heyday of South by Southwest.
Well, and you say heyday, what you mean is the authentic value,
yes,
versus the thing that continues to grow, that grows
right,
because in fact it caters to a more public interpretation.
Right.
Okay.
And where education appears in that vision, I'm not sure. Interesting.
Okay, well, we'll see if we get any feedback. If not, you and I we'll have fun talking about it. Okay, I did want to mention the Apple third quarter report, especially because there were just some stunning figures there, right?
Yeah.
2 iPads were sold for every Mac to K-12 customers at a time when they sold more Macs than ever to schools. So this means a huge market.
Yeah, I mean, Apple, I think Apple has, we've talked about this before. Apple has sort of stayed in the good graces of the education system, even when I think the rest of the world went Windows. A lot of educators, a lot of schools stayed with Apple products, and it's interesting now to see the sort of explosion in the consumer world in interest in Apple, and watching how Apple will or will not think about their relationship, their long-standing relationship with education. of course, the iPads have become terrifically popular, and I think that I think that there are some good reasons to adopt iPads and some not so good reasons to adopt iPads. There's certainly things that you can't do on an iPad that I would much rather see students have their own. If we're going to talk about one-to-one devices, I'd much rather students have a laptop, something that they can actually do programming with, that they can actually crack open, like have a command line, have a little bit more control over rather than just this sort of closed Apple ecosystem. But certainly these, my concerns aren't shared by schools that really do seem to be adopting iPads at a rapid rate. But despite the buzz around iPads, I think it's important to note that schools are buying more Macs as well. Partially, I think because if you're using a bunch of iPads, then you are sort of, how clever Apple is, you are stuck in this Apple, in an Apple ecosystem where you're more comfortable, I think, using Apple products. But it's certainly good news for Apple, and it'll be really interesting to watch if Apple now becomes more responsive to some of the questions and concerns that the educators have around simply just being able to, easily facilitate these devices in a school setting.
This is another dilemma. I mean, obviously, really well-designed products, but like you said, a very closed environment, and not just closed, proactively closed, right? I mean, new announcements, that continue to keep things closed. So you can't fault the company for doing a good job marketing and selling their products. Right? I mean, that's the dilemma for me, right? So I want to find fault, but this is what companies do, and Apple's doing a very good job. How do you constructively criticize this when it looks like the end result will be so bad for the general ecosystem?
Well, I mean, and I think that one of I think too about this Apple's real penchant for control. How does that fit with, I think, what tends to be sort of sometimes the ugly side of schools and technology? So schools wanting to crack down on what websites students can access, and in ways that go far beyond sort of policy requirements. Schools wanting to monitor and control what applications students download, and not just because they're concerned about viruses, but because they treat computers and they treat computers as something that needs to be controlled rather than something that actually is part of a student's open-ended exploration and sort of tinkering and hacking. And I don't mean hacking into systems, but I mean just sort of learning how to be comfortable with your own and control your own technology. I upgraded my Mac to the latest operating system last week, and went to install a piece of software, and it wouldn't let me because I hadn't downloaded it through the official Apple App Store, and I had to go into my preferences and set it. And actually have a setting to allow me to download the software that I wanted to onto my own computer. And it gave me a warning saying, do you know by doing this, this is a dangerous, it was filled with all of this, danger. Downloading software is a dangerous thing. You're opening up your system to viruses, and thinking, it was an unnecessary, and I think a message that certainly made me frown as a Mac owner.
Is there I don't think I've ever thought of this, but I need you to confirm that this is an accurate perception. Seems like that's a Skinnerian position versus the Paulo Freire, which would be kind of the open source Richard Stallman Android world.
Yeah. Well, and I think about some of some Papworth's ideas about why we should give computing device, why each student should have their own computer, and it is about exploration. It's not about control. It is about students, students having agency, students having access, and not students being given this restricted set of tools that they can only work within certain parameters that have been dictated. And in this case, dictated not just by their classroom teacher, not by their parents, not by the school district, but dictated by a technology corporation that has decided what's best for all of us. And it's certainly technology. This is not technology as liberatory. This is technology as control.
So why are you an Apple user? I don't say that as a criticism. I think there's a truth here, right? Which is Apple's done such a good job in certain ways. In the same way that I use Google Chrome more than I use Firefox, but I make a convenience choice.
Well, and I think that there are the abilities. I can still sort of work. There are still workarounds with the Mac. I can get into the preferences and reset things and bypass all of these controls that I think less tech-savvy users wouldn't know how to do. I mean, there's certainly still the ability to jailbreak my phone, but I definitely feel as though this, Apple, the path that Apple's on in terms of controlling the ecosystem is one that I think, I definitely will have to think about when it comes time to replace this machine. Do I really want, what do I want in terms of hardware? What do I want in terms of operating system? And is there a way that I can hack together the best of both worlds with what I think is the superior hardware of Apple products and yet, installing another operating system onto it? Interesting.
Okay, so you do bring, again, to the month of July, your new and noteworthy educational apps, and there's an Android app in there, and there's a free version of it. So amazing.
Have you played it?
No, I just downloaded it when I read the story.
It's fun. This is the latest app by Rovio, the makers of what is now the ubiquitous Angry Birds. And I think any time you have to follow up as a company, you have to sort of follow up on what is a hugely successful game, and what's become sort of a franchise for the company as well. It's always sort of iffy to see how well you'll follow up. And I actually love Amazing Alex. I wasn't sure at first. There were some teachers that had done some really interesting things with thinking about using Angry Birds in the classroom in physics in particular, thinking about how do those birds move? So do they obey the laws of physics? How can we calculate velocity and angles and momentum, and how does gravity work? And what I love about Amazing Alex is that the company has taken that same sort of physics approach and added it in a way that's a lot more open-ended. So Alex is a little boy who's building these sort of Rube Goldberg-like contraptions with stuff in his garage in order to make balls bounce into certain hoops. You have to sort of assemble things in different ways and think about angles in physics. And I think it's quite a delightful little game. And yes, it's on Android.
Yes, very fun. Okay, we don't have a lot of time for the news, but some stories that really need to be discussed. The report on for-profit colleges.
Yes.
Wow.
So this was really quite a damning report from Senator Tom Harkin, who has conducted sort of a lengthy, I think, several multi-year investigation into for-profit colleges, and I think, looking here, and again, as I was reading the report, thinking how much we're seeing for-profit companies enter the K-12 space, and this new, sort of, I guess you'd say, revived interest in education technology investment, in companies just within the industry. I think that this is a really important lead to think about who's profiting and who's being exploited, what are the outcomes, and some of the figures. The CEOs of these universities are paid on average $7.3 million. I think one of them walked away with a salary of $41 million. The ways in which they're taking advantage of vets, that the graduation rates remain terribly low. Money is spent on marketing, but once students sign up, there's really no commitment to help that student be successful in college, be successful in school. So certainly lots of red flags about for-profits in higher ed, but I think it's something that K-12 really needs to think about right now, particularly with the number of new for-profits who are offering online education, online schools at the K-12 level.
It's hard to read that story and not think about the privatization of our prisons in this country.
Yep.
Feels as though both end up creating reward systems that in some cases are almost the exact opposite of what the institution should be accomplishing.
Right.
Okay. Again, I'm sorry. I'm under a time constraint, so I'm skipping down past some of this. I wanted to ask you about founder dating. I did get an email from Jesse Aurora about this, a matchmaking service for entrepreneurs looking for co-founders. I couldn't really tell how to feel about it. What's your sense?
Yeah, I couldn't really tell. I mean, I'm not really sure what to think about it either. And I'm at a hackathon with Jessie this weekend here in the Bay Area, and I hung out with her a little bit yesterday at the Stanford LTV Expo, and we talked a little bit about some of these questions of. So I should think of Founder Dating is a company that does matchmaking services for people who want to start their own technology companies that don't have a co-founder, and in many cases that don't have a technical co-founder. But how do you find people that you want to start a business with? And I think that's a real challenge. So thinking about a matchmaking service to pair people up, much like dating, is can you really algorithmically find people that are a good pair to go into business? So Founder Dating is now interested in the education vertical. They've partnered with Teach for America to try to, again, match people who have some experience in the classroom as TFA and to have some some education experience, some industry experience, match them with folks who are also interested in starting education companies.
So this again kind of...
I don't know. I'm not sure that this is the right way to think about starting a company.
Well, I guess a red flag for me was the whole Teach for America piece. Not that should in any way necessarily exclude somebody who's passionately interested, but it does feel like this kind of harkens to your Audrey test story of valuing the outside perspective more than the seasoned or deep inside perspective. And I just didn't know how to respond. In part because I'm thinking, is this really the lever that will move education, or could they have involved, the 20,000, about 15,000, educators who regularly attend ISTE, or other places in which there are people who have thought deeply about these things. Maybe it's not fair, but it felt again to me like this was consciously taking the outsider perspective.
Yeah, and this, it's really interesting. So I'm at a hackathon this weekend that Jessie Aurora has organized, and this isn't actually a hackathon about building their company. So she's trying to bring together teachers who have specific needs that they'd like to see built to make their lives easier in their classroom. And then there's actually a huge number of students, middle school and high school age students here as well, thinking about the technology problems that they have in their classes, and matching them up with developers who want to build. Again, this isn't about building a company. It's about building something so that it could be building a product, could be building a feature, could be building a workaround. It could be an app. It just could be having a conversation about what pain points, having a conversation with other people outside your school about pain points in education and technology. And so in some ways, I really was interested to come to this and see, because I think that this notion that a startup is the answer, or a business is the answer, or even that technology is the answer, is something that I'm not certain that's always the case. I'm not certain that everything is worth. Not every great idea is a business, and not every great problem requires a business solution.
You've just made another argument for the Audrey and Steve conversation tour.
That's right.
Okay, really discouraging statistics about student loans. Those who are defaulting fall into some pretty identifiable categories. Yeah,
and I mean it's not surprising, but here again we see what is really, I would say, the terrible toll that for-profit universities are taking. And again, we're seeing a lot of talk about the higher education bubble. Is going to school worth it? A lot of hand-wringing about student loan debt, and rightly so. And I say that as someone that's got her fair share of student loan debt. But when you look at the statistics, that 47% of the people who are defaulting on their student loans haven't even completed their degree, and 65% of folks went again to for-profit universities. So, what is the problem the high cost of college? Sure, but it seems like there are some other factors going on as well: unemployment, and certainly these predatory practices of for-profits that are luring students in and then not actually helping them succeed.
Right. Well, and the majority not actually having graduated.
Right.
And then finally, just some hard poverty statistics. 25% of the 3.5 million kindergartners enrolled in the last school year came from families living below the poverty level.
Yeah, and I think that's when we have these conversations around, again, around education being broken, what's working and what's not working in schools and why. I think that we always have to look at this question of poverty, and as we see, increasing poverty in this country, thinking about how can we address that issue before we sort of sail off in these new directions of privatizing schools or testing more or firing teachers or sort of adjusting the controls on another system, when really we need to be looking at how are we supporting sort of families and children that are at risk. Because I think that once you have a quarter of the population of kindergartners living below poverty, then the problem isn't that schools are failing. The problem is elsewhere.
Sobering way to finish, but thank you, Audrey, so much for another great week of thoughtful conversation and terrific content. Have a great week, everybody.
And thanks for all of the Connected Educator Month stuff. So great stuff going on this month.
I slept in quite a bit this morning.
I'm sure you did.
Lots more fun coming up on Connected Educator Month. If you missed the first 3-day kickoff in which we had some great panels and keynote speakers, those recordings are posted on my blog site at stevehargadon.com, and it will be up at connectededucatormonth.org next week. And then don't miss the Learning 2.0 virtual conference. Audrey will be a keynoter. Very excited about that.
Right.
Sugata Mitra's coming on, Mark Prensky, lots of varied voices. It should be a lot of fun.
I'm looking forward to that.
Thanks, Audrey.
Great. Thanks, Steve.
Take care. Bye.
Bye.